Behind the glitz, glamour, and golden lights of old Hollywood lurked a far grittier reality, one ruled not by the soft smiles of matinee idols, but by men who carried real scars, real grudges, and real darkness. These weren't just actors playing tough guys. They were tough. Some had blood on their hands from war, others from barroom brawls, criminal pasts, or ties to shadowy underworlds. Directors feared them. Studios couldn't control them, and co-stars walked on eggshells around them. These were the legends whose off-screen lives were as brutal and unforgiving as the roles they immortalized. Welcome to the world of the most feared tough guys of old Hollywood, where fame met fists and secrets whispered louder than scripts. James Cagney, the gentleman gangster who could explode at any second. He stood just over 5 feet tall, but when James Cagney walked into a room, men twice his size shrank back. There was something electric about him, a quiet storm tucked behind a crooked grin, a jittery energy that hinted he could go off at any moment. On screen, he made his name playing fast-talking, trigger-tempered gangsters, but the real secret? He didn't have to act. That fire was already inside him. Born in the tenements of New York City, Cagney grew up on the edge, not quite a criminal, not quite a saint, just smart enough to keep from being either. He fought his way through back-alley scraps and rough jobs before finding the stage, and when he finally broke into Hollywood, he didn't just arrive, he detonated. The Public Enemy wasn't just a film, it was a warning shot. Here was a new kind of star, intense, unpredictable, and completely unafraid to look dangerous. But what really made people fear Cagney wasn't his fists, it was his fuse. Studio executives learned not to cross him. Directors learned to tread lightly. Even the FBI took notice when whispers floated around that he might be too convincing in his roles. In truth, Cagney had no criminal ties, but he understood that fear was a currency in Hollywood, and he never spent it recklessly. Off camera, he was a paradox, fiercely loyal, politically active, and a lover of poetry and dance. But the moment the director called action, something else took over, something raw and volcanic. That duality, that unpredictable mix of refinement and rage, made him unforgettable. And in a town of make-believe, James Cagney was terrifyingly real. Edward G. Robinson, the brain behind the bullet. He wasn't tall. He wasn't handsome. And yet, when Edward G. Robinson stepped into a scene, all eyes fell on him, not because he looked like a killer, but because he thought like one. The menace didn't come from muscles. It came from something colder, something calculated. Robinson wasn't the thug in the alley. He was the mind in the shadows, pulling the strings, writing the rules, and deciding who didn't make it to morning. Best known as Rico in Little Caesar, Robinson created the blueprint for the cinematic gangster. Not the snarling brute, but the businessman of violence, measured, efficient, chillingly rational. His voice, with that sharp staccato delivery, could cut glass. He made audiences believe he knew things you didn't want him to know about you. And off-screen, that razor intellect wasn't just an act. A polyglot, an art collector, a student of philosophy, Robinson read Nietzsche in his dressing room and quoted Shakespeare in between takes. But beneath the cultured exterior was a man fiercely aware of power and the quiet ways it moved through a room. He didn't shout to make his presence known. He didn't need to. There was something about his stare, the way he held silence just a second too long, that made even seasoned co-stars stumble over their lines. What truly made Robinson feared in Hollywood wasn't scandal or scandalous behavior, it was control. Cold, unwavering control. He chose roles like a chess master, often turning down big money for more complex characters. And when the McCarthy era came knocking, accusing him of subversion, Robinson didn't flinch. He turned his testimony into a performance. Calm, sharp, unapologetic. In an industry fueled by ego and chaos, Edward G. Robinson was the rare storm you never saw coming. Not loud, not showy, but lethal all the same. Humphrey Bogart, the last man you wanted to owe a drink. There was something in the way he leaned, half boredom, half warning. Humphrey Bogart didn't play tough guys. He was one, but not the kind that needed to throw a punch to prove it. He was the kind that would just stand there, cigarette burning down to the filter, eyes steady, waiting for you to flinch first. And if you didn't, well, then maybe you had his respect. Maybe. Before he became the voice of American noir, Bogart was a question mark in Hollywood. Hard to cast, harder to understand. Too sharp to be the brute. Too cold to be the hero. But when the roles finally caught up with him, in The Maltese Falcon, Casablanca, To Have and Have Not, he stopped being an actor and started being a myth. Bogart wasn't feared because of what he did, but because of what he refused to do. He wouldn't kiss up to studios. He wouldn't soften his image. He wouldn't pretend to be anyone other than exactly who he was. Even as the industry around him chased trends and played politics, Bogart remained stone. Off-screen, he was the same man you saw in shadows and rain-slicked alleys, sardonic, unreadable, ready with a comeback that could cut the air in two. He drank hard, fought harder, and held grudges with the kind of precision you'd expect from someone who knew what it meant to be betrayed. Directors walked lightly around him. Co-stars, even the great ones, respected the unspoken rule. With Bogart, you didn't pretend to be tough. You were, or you weren't invited back. By the time he co-founded the Rat Pack, Bogart was no longer just a movie star. He was the godfather of cool, untouchable, unshakable, and just dangerous enough that no one ever dared ask where the line really was. Lee Marvin, built from shrapnel and whiskey. Lee Marvin didn't act tough. He didn't have to. His life was the rehearsal, and Hollywood was just the aftershock. Before he ever stepped in front of a camera, he'd already been blown apart on a Pacific island in World War II, where he was shot, shredded, and left for dead. He came back patched up with steel in his spine, both literally and otherwise, and from that day forward, nothing scared him. Not pain, not death, certainly not Hollywood. You could spot Marvin from a mile off. The gravel voice, the jagged face, the dead man's stare. He looked like he'd been sculpted from concrete and hung over mornings. On screen, he didn't play angry. He was anger, distilled into a slow-burning presence that kept everyone around him on edge. In The Dirty Dozen, Point Blank, and Hell in the Pacific, he didn't pretend to be a man who could do damage. He simply existed as one. And off-screen, that line between character and reality didn't exist. He drank like the bar owed him money, fought like he enjoyed it, and moved through the world with the weary confidence of a man who'd already seen its worst and come out the other side unimpressed. Directors prayed for a good day with him. Co-stars stayed sharp, because the moment you disrespected the work, or worse, tried to fake your toughness, Marvin would smell it and shut you down without a word. But there was something noble, even tragic, beneath the scars. Marvin loathed phoniness. He had no patience for ego, though he had enough of his own to fill a room. He was in many ways Hollywood's last blunt instrument, unapologetically masculine, physically broken, and morally complicated. A man too real for the world he worked in, and far too dangerous to be forgotten. Robert Mitchum, cooler than the cops chasing him. Robert Mitchum walked through life like he already knew how the movie ended, and he wasn't impressed. He didn't strut, didn't shout, didn't need to. His power was in how little he reacted. Whether facing down a thug, a co-star, or a scandal, Mitchum made one thing crystal clear. You couldn't rattle a man who genuinely didn't care. There was always something half asleep about Mitchum, the heavy-lidded eyes, the lazy baritone, the slow, deliberate movements, but it wasn't lethargy. It was control. Cold, dangerous control. On screen, he became the embodiment of effortless menace. In Out of the Past, he was the thinking man's noir antihero. In Cape Fear, he was the nightmare you couldn't wake from. He didn't raise his voice. He just let the silence do the killing. But Mitchum's real legend was forged in what happened between the takes. Hollywood tried to tame him. They gave him the matinee idol treatment, tried to polish the edges. It didn't take. Mitchum drank when he wanted, vanished when he felt like it, and made it clear from the start that no studio owned him. He once said, "I have two kinds of acting, with and without a horse." That wasn't humility. That was warning. He found himself in handcuffs more than once, but the headlines never stuck. In fact, they only added to his myth. Mitchum didn't defend himself because he didn't have to. He knew public opinion would come around. He always played the long game, calm, quiet, and just amused enough to let you think you were winning. The fear around Mitchum wasn't about violence. It was about knowing. He looked through people, through lies, through the stagecraft of fame. And when someone that cool knows exactly who you are, you start to sweat, even if he never raises a hand. Sterling Hayden, the spy who hated fame. Sterling Hayden was the kind of man you'd expect to find in a dusty Hemingway novel, drifting through war zones, smoking in shadows, running contraband through dangerous waters, not posing for stills in front of studio backlots. Hollywood tried to frame him as just another square-jawed leading man, but they had no idea what they'd brought into the room. Hayden wasn't just hard, he was untouchable, because he didn't want what they were offering. Before the cameras ever rolled, Hayden had already lived a dozen lifetimes. Merchant Marine at 17. OSS agent during World War II, sailing into Nazi-infested waters under fake names and false flags. He didn't play soldiers, he was one. He didn't study espionage, he wrote the field manual. While others rehearsed their war scenes in costume, Hayden disappeared behind enemy lines with nothing but a code book and a loaded conscience. And when he came back, he walked into Hollywood like a man half-finished, not quite actor, not quite fugitive. He hated the system, but used it when it suited him. He took big paychecks to fund his boats, then vanished for months, chasing storms and solitude. He didn't need the spotlight. In truth, he loathed it. But when the right role came, the asphalt jungle, Dr. Strangelove, The Killing, he brought a kind of hard-won gravity that no acting school could teach. What made Hayden feared wasn't violence or vice. It was his freedom. That terrified the studios. They couldn't break him, couldn't blackmail him with fame or fortune. He'd already walked away from both. His silence in interviews said more than most actors' biographies. And when he finally did speak, it wasn't about the movies, it was about betrayal, regret, the weight of choices made in shadows. In a town built on illusion, Sterling Hayden was the ghost in the machine, real, restless, and utterly impossible to own. Charles Bronson, the face that didn't blink. Charles Bronson didn't speak unless it mattered, and when he did, it sounded like gravel being dragged across a steel floor. You didn't come to him for charm, for lightness, or for laughs. You came to Bronson when you needed a character who meant it. He was the last stop before vengeance. The man you sent in when all the polite options were exhausted. The hammer in human form. Born into poverty, so crushing it left scars on his silence, Bronson came from the kind of hard labor that no Hollywood producer could fake. One of 15 children in a coal mining family, he grew up breathing in soot and working with hands that didn't need a stunt double. He didn't just survive hardship, he absorbed it until it settled into his bones. That weight, that stillness, it never left him. When he arrived in Hollywood, he wasn't handed anything. He was too rough, too quiet, too real. But what others saw as limitations, he wore like armor. He let the silence do the talking, and when the industry finally caught on, with roles in The Magnificent Seven, Once Upon a Time in the West, and Death Wish, he didn't change a thing. He didn't become a star by trying to be one. He became a star because he didn't care if you noticed. Off-screen, Bronson was private to the point of myth. He didn't play games with the press, didn't schmooze, didn't charm the room. His co-stars described him as intimidating, not because he was cruel, but because he didn't need anyone. And in Hollywood, that kind of independence was dangerous. It meant he couldn't be controlled. There was no act with Charles Bronson. No public version, no mask. Just a man shaped by fire, war, and coal dust, whose silence said more than most actors' entire scripts, and whose eyes held the kind of stillness that made even the toughest in the room look away first. Steve McQueen, cool as a loaded gun. Steve McQueen didn't ask for respect. He took it, usually without saying a word. There was something in his stare, something caged and coiled, that told you everything you needed to know. Don't push him, don't lie to him, and never, never underestimate him. McQueen wasn't the fastest talker in the room, but he was always the fastest to the door, to the bike, to the getaway. He moved like a man born a split second ahead of everyone else, always close to escape. Raised in reform schools and on the fringes of the American dream, McQueen never shed that outlaw edge. It clung to him through the fame, the fortune, the Ferraris. He was the star who didn't want to be won, the actor who refused to be molded. On set, he was unpredictable, competitive to the point of paranoia, and utterly allergic to authority. Directors feared his silences. Co-stars feared his need to win the frame. And studios? They feared the day he'd stop showing up. Or worse, show up and refuse to play nice. In Bullet, The Great Escape, The Getaway, McQueen wasn't just acting, he was revealing. Every glance was a challenge. Every line a test. There was a storm just beneath the surface, and audiences couldn't look away, because part of them wondered what would happen if it ever broke loose. He did his own stunts, raced his own cars, picked his own scripts, and lived like the rules were written for somebody else. His on-screen cool wasn't a performance, it was a shield. A way to survive in a world he didn't trust and maybe never fully joined. Steve McQueen didn't need to raise his voice. His presence was louder than most men's rage. And if you tried to own him, he was already gone, taillights fading, dust rising, heart still running from a world that never felt fast enough. Marlon Brando, the genius who lit the match, then walked away. Marlon Brando didn't enter scenes, he invaded them. He carried silence like a weapon, used stillness like a dare. And when he finally spoke, the words didn't sound like dialogue, they sounded like secrets, half-whispered by someone who knew too much and cared too little about your rules. Brando was more than a performer. He was a force. And forces are feared, especially when they can't be controlled. When he exploded onto the screen in a streetcar named Desire, it was clear that the old order, the clean-cut heroes, the stiff upper lips, the painted-on smiles, was finished. Brando didn't play characters. He became them. He didn't just say lines. He lived inside them, twitching, brooding, erupting. He turned method acting into a kind of ritual, and directors quickly learned. You didn't direct Brando, you survived him. He was brilliant, yes. But brilliance came with a price. He showed up late, or not at all. He'd rewrite scenes, derail rehearsals, sabotage co-stars without blinking. And yet, you couldn't fire him, because the moment the camera rolled, he delivered something real. Something dangerous. Studios feared his defiance, but they feared irrelevance more, and Brando made everything else look dated. Off-screen, he was even more volatile. 1 minute, charming. The next, stormy, withdrawn, or suddenly confrontational. He had a soft voice and sharp instincts. He could see through Hollywood's games, and he played his own instead, always one move ahead. He could destroy a room with a whisper, leave an interviewer speechless with a glance, and burn down expectations without ever raising his voice. Marlon Brando wasn't just acting for the camera, he was acting against the entire system. He didn't want fame. He wanted truth. And the industry he helped build? He also made sure it would never fully understand or forget him. Clark Gable, the king with fire in his gut. Clark Gable's smile could light up a room, but no one ever mistook that charm for softness. Behind the devil-may-care grin and dashing screen presence was a man forged by hard losses, personal demons, and a lifetime of knowing exactly who he was, and who he'd never let anyone make him into. Gable wasn't feared because he was cruel. He was feared because he was untouchably assured. He didn't bluff. He didn't flinch. And when he said no, it was final. Born into nothing, raised without luxury, and working odd jobs long before the movies ever knew his name, Gable climbed through the system the hard way, by outlasting it. He wasn't handed stardom. He took it. By the time Gone with the Wind came around, he wasn't just a romantic lead, he was a cultural icon. But what made Gable a king wasn't the fan mail or the tuxedos. It was what simmered underneath: discipline, intensity, and a code of self-reliance that never wavered. On set, he ran things like a captain at war. He was direct, professional, and expected the same from everyone around him. If you came unprepared, Gable wouldn't yell. He'd dismiss you with an expression that said more than any outburst ever could. Directors respected him. Co-stars watched their step. Studios gave him space. Because while others played at being powerful, Gable was power, silent, grounded, and unwavering. And when World War II erupted, he didn't just donate money or smile for the cameras. He enlisted, flew real missions, risked real death. No entourage, no special treatment, just a man doing what needed to be done. And when he came back, he never talked much about it, because Gable didn't need to prove his toughness. He lived it. To the world, he was elegance. But to those who worked beside him, he was a storm in a tailored suit with a spine of iron and a heart that had been through fire. John Garfield, the outsider who dared to stay real. John Garfield didn't arrive in Hollywood. He crashed into it with fists clenched and soul exposed. He wasn't bred in acting schools or studio workshops. He came from the streets, New York's Lower East Side, where survival was the only script that mattered. And when he stepped in front of a camera, he didn't perform, he confessed. Every role felt like a whisper from a man who'd seen too much, trusted too little, and had no time for anything fake. Garfield wasn't classically handsome. He wasn't polished. But he had something rarer, truth. That rough-hewn honesty, the twitch of uncertainty behind the eyes, the way his voice could tremble with rage or tenderness, it made audiences lean in. In Body and Soul, the postman always rings twice, force of evil. He brought fire, vulnerability, and danger in equal measure. You couldn't look away. But it wasn't just his performances that made Hollywood nervous. It was his conscience. Garfield never forgot where he came from. He supported labor rights, spoke his mind, refused to cozy up to power. And when the blacklist era came, when actors were expected to name names, sell out their friends, and save their careers, Garfield stood alone. Silent, unmoving. Not because he was stubborn, but because he was loyal. Even when it cost him everything. The studios began to freeze him out. His name, once headlining marquees, began to vanish. But Garfield didn't beg, didn't bend. He stayed proud, even as the walls closed in. That's what made him feared, not his fists, but his refusal to flinch. In an industry built on compromise, he was a man who wouldn't make the trade. He died too young, under pressure no human should carry, but he never lost what made him dangerous. His soul intact, his truth unsold. George C. Scott, the volcano with a script. George C. Scott didn't walk into roles, he erupted into them. With a voice like cannon fire and eyes that burned through celluloid, he wasn't the kind of actor you enjoyed. He was the kind you survived. Every performance felt like an event. Every line a confrontation. To watch him work was to feel slightly endangered, as if the fourth wall might shatter, and he'd suddenly be in your living room, asking what you believed in. He didn't do charm. He didn't do small talk. What he did, with terrifying clarity, was truth. Not the polished kind, but the jagged, uncomfortable, soul-stripping kind. In Patton, the hustler, Dr. Strangelove, he didn't simply become a character. He overpowered him, pulling something monstrous and magnificent from inside and throwing it straight onto the screen. He acted like it was war, and everyone else was underprepared. But the real fire burned off screen. Scott hated the Hollywood machine, hated phoniness, hated awards. When the Academy tried to give him an Oscar, he told them to keep it. Literally, the whole thing is a meat parade, he said without blinking. He wasn't being dramatic, he meant it. Because for Scott, acting wasn't about fame or legacy. It was about facing the abyss and dragging something honest back from it. He could be thunderous, impossible, volatile. Directors either revered him or refused to work with him again. His presence altered the set. His moods shifted the energy in a room. He was a one-man storm system, and everyone learned quickly. You don't fake it around George C. Scott. You show up, you bleed a little, or you get out of the way. Because if Brando broke the rules, Scott set them on fire. 12 men, 12 legends, each one cut from a different cloth, but stitched together by something rare. A toughness that couldn't be faked, a presence that couldn't be ignored, and fire that still burns through the film reels of history. They didn't just star in movies, they defined an era. An era where grit, guts, and authenticity weren't just character traits, they were survival. These weren't perfect men. They were complicated, flawed, human, but that's what made them unforgettable. Whether it was a glare from Cagney, a whisper from Mitchum, or the storm behind George C. Scott's voice, these actors carried real weight. And in a world that often values polish over truth, they reminded us that strength often comes with scars and silence can speak louder than a monologue. If these stories moved you, if one of these legends holds a special place in your heart, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I'll be replying, because this channel isn't just about content, it's about conversation. Who's your favorite tough guy from old Hollywood? Who do you think deserves a spot on the next list? Let's talk about it. And if you love daily deep dives like this into the world of old Hollywood, the icons, the myths, the moments that shaped cinema, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. Until tomorrow, stay curious, stay respectful, and never forget, real legends don't shout. They cast shadows.